People say everyone has a story worth telling, but some stories burn brighter than others. This one started on a rain-soaked Tuesday in October, in the fading light of Riverside High's empty hallways. As editor of the school newspaper, I often stayed late, long after the last bell had rung and the crowds had dispersed. The quiet helped me think, helped me write, but that evening I wasn't alone. I first caught a glimpse of her reflection in a rain-streaked window. Sophie Montgomery, the unofficial queen of Riverside High. She was sitting alone in Mr. Peterson's English classroom, bent over something on her desk, her long honey-blonde hair falling like a curtain around her face. I probably wouldn't have thought twice about it, except for the way her shoulders trembled slightly. Sophie Montgomery was crying. Let me back up a bit. Everyone knew Sophie Montgomery, or thought they did. Straight-A student, daughter of real estate mogul Richard Montgomery, and quite possibly the most beautiful girl to ever walk Riverside's halls. She had the kind of beauty that made people stop mid-sentence, the kind that inspired amateur poets and filled entire pages of our yearbook. But what made her truly remarkable wasn't her looks. It was the fact that she'd never dated anyone. Not once. Not ever. It wasn't for lack of offers. Star athletes, class presidents, and even a few teachers' sons had tried their luck. Each attempt met with the same gentle but firm rejection. After a while, theories started circulating. Some said she was secretly engaged to some European aristocrat. Others whispered she was just too proud, too cold. The nastier rumors suggested darker reasons. But as someone who'd spent 3 years observing people from behind a camera lens for the school paper, I'd noticed something different about Sophie. She wasn't cold at all. She was lonely. I must have made some sound because she suddenly looked up, hastily wiping her eyes. "Oh, Ben, I didn't realize anyone was still here." Her voice was steady, but her hands were quickly gathering up scattered papers from her desk. "Sorry," I said, stepping into the doorway. "I was just heading out and saw." I gestured vaguely, not wanting to mention her tears. "Are you okay?" She gave me a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Of course, just finishing up some college applications." That's when I saw it, the paper she'd missed in her hurry to clear the desk. It wasn't a college application. It was a letter written in careful, flowing handwriting. And it began with, "Dear Marcus." Marcus. The name hit me like a thunderbolt. There was only one Marcus at Riverside, Marcus Sullivan, the janitor's son. He'd been in our class until last spring, when he quietly dropped out to help support his family after his father's accident. I remembered him as the quiet kid who always had his nose in a book, who'd won the state poetry competition twice, but couldn't afford the trip to nationals. Sophie saw where my eyes had landed and snatched up the letter, her face flushing. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The rain drummed against the windows, filling the silence with its steady rhythm. "It's not what you think," she said finally, but her voice wavered. "I don't think anything," I replied carefully. "And even if I did, it's none of my business." She stared at me for a long moment, as if trying to read something in my face. Then, to my complete surprise, she started to cry again. Not the quiet tears from before, but deep, shoulder-shaking sobs that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside her. I did the only thing I could think of. I closed the classroom door and sat down at the desk across from her. "I haven't told anyone," she whispered after her sobs had quieted. "Not a single soul. And some days I feel like I'm going to explode from keeping it all inside." She looked up at me, her green eyes bright with tears. "Do you want to know the truth, Ben? The real reason I've never dated anyone at Riverside?" I nodded, and Sophie Montgomery, the most beautiful girl in school, the untouchable ice queen, began to tell me a love story. One that would change not only her life but mine as well. It had started, she told me, on a day much like this one, almost exactly a year ago. She'd been in the library after hours, hiding from another well-meaning attempt at matchmaking by her mother. Marcus had been there too, shelving books from his cart, and they'd gotten into a conversation about poetry, specifically Pablo Neruda's love sonnets. He quoted Sonnet 17 from memory, Sophie said, a small smile playing at her lips. I love you without knowing how or when or from where. And the way he said it, it wasn't like he was trying to impress me. He just loved the words so much they seemed to flow out of him naturally. They talked for hours that day, long after the library should have closed. About books, about dreams, about the weight of expectations. Marcus told her about his father's accident, about taking the janitor job to help with bills, about still hoping to go to college someday. She told him about the suffocating pressure of being Richard Montgomery's perfect daughter, about her secret dream of becoming a teacher instead of going to business school. It was the first time in my life, Sophie said, that someone saw me, really saw me, as more than just a pretty face or a future CEO. After that day, they'd started leaving notes for each other. Hidden in library books at first, then proper letters. Daily correspondence that grew more personal, more intimate with each exchange. Through their words, they built a private world that existed outside of Riverside's rigid social hierarchy. The letters are everything, Sophie explained, clutching the one in her hand. They're the only place where we can be completely honest, completely ourselves. Where I can tell him how much She trailed off, blushing. How much you love him, I finished quietly. She nodded, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. But it's impossible. My parents would never understand. His father is barely making ends meet, and mine, God, my father would probably buy the school just to fire Mr. Sullivan out of spite. And Marcus is so proud, so determined not to hold me back. She took a shaky breath. Sometimes I think it would be easier if we'd never met. But then I read his letters, and I can't imagine my life without them. Without him. The rain had stopped by then, and the setting sun was painting the classroom in shades of gold and purple. Sophie carefully folded her letter and slipped it into an envelope. Why are you telling me all this? I asked finally. She gave me a sad smile. Because you're the first person who saw me crying and asked if I was okay instead of just assuming everything in my life is perfect. Because you run the school paper, but I know you've never printed a single piece of cruel gossip. And because, she hesitated, I think I'm about to need a friend who understands. What do you mean? My parents are throwing a graduation gala next month. They've invited the son of their biggest investor, and my mother has made it very clear that she expects us to connect. She squared her shoulders, trying to look brave despite the trembling in her voice. I don't know what to do, Ben. I really don't. As I watched her gather her things and head for the door, I had no idea that this was just the beginning. I couldn't have known that in the coming months. I would become entangled in a love story that would challenge everything I thought I knew about class, family, and courage. Or that Sophie Montgomery's secret would spark a chain of events that would change our entire school forever. All I knew was that I had just glimpsed something real and rare, a love that existed in the spaces between social classes, in the quiet moments after school, in words carefully written and secretly shared. And somehow, I knew I couldn't just walk away from it. Sophie, I called out just as she reached the door. She turned back, her hand on the handle. I'll help. Whatever you need. The smile she gave me then was genuine, small and grateful and a little bit afraid. Thank you, Ben, she said softly. Then she was gone, leaving me alone in the darkening classroom with the weight of her secret and the first chapter of a story I never expected to tell. The thing about secrets is that once you know them, you start seeing everything differently. In the weeks following my discovery of Sophie and Marcus's correspondence, I began noticing all the little things I'd missed before, like how Sophie always took the long way to her classes, passing by wherever Marcus happened to be working. Their eyes never met, their faces remained carefully neutral, but there was an almost tangible energy in those brief moments of proximity. Or how Marcus would leave the tiniest traces of his presence. A carefully arranged stack of books on Sophie's usual library table, a fresh flower somehow finding its way into her locker vent. I also started paying more attention to Marcus himself. He was easy to overlook, dressed in his father's old work clothes, moving quietly through the school's halls before dawn and after dusk. But there was an undeniable dignity in the way he carried himself, a quiet intelligence in his eyes that reminded me of Sophie's description of their first real conversation. One morning, I arrived early to school to finish laying out the newspaper and found him in the hallway, mopping the floors. He was listening to something through a single earbud, his lips moving silently. Poetry? I asked before I could stop myself. He startled slightly, then gave me a measured look. Preparing for the state certification exam, actually, he said after a moment. They have audio courses now. Makes the work go faster. That's when I noticed the textbooks peeking out of his worn backpack, advanced placement study guides, SAT prep materials, a dog-eared copy of college essays that made a difference. You're still studying, I said. Not really a question. Some dreams don't die just because life gets complicated. He wrung out his mop with more force than necessary, even if some people think they should. Before I could respond, the click of heels on tile interrupted us. Sophie's mother, Victoria Montgomery, was striding down the hall, designer handbags swinging from her arm. Marcus immediately stepped back, pressing himself against the wall, becoming almost invisible, a skill I realized he must have perfected over months of secret meetings. Benjamin, isn't it? Mrs. Montgomery's smile was professional, practiced. The school newspaper editor? I'm so glad I ran into you. You'll be covering Sophie's graduation gala, of course. It wasn't really a question. Of course, Mrs. Montgomery. Wonderful. We're expecting James Richardson to attend, of Richardson Financial. Such a lovely young man about Sophie's age. She lowered her voice conspiratorially. Between us, we're hoping it might be the start of something special. Sophie's been so resistant to dating. It's not natural for a girl her age. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Marcus's knuckles whiten around the mop handle. Maybe she's just focused on her studies, I suggested. Oh, there's time for both. Look at me. I met Richard at a gala just like this one when we were Sophie's age. Sometimes these things need a little orchestration. She patted my arm. Make sure to get plenty of photos of Sophie and James together, won't you? After she clicked away, I turned to Marcus, but he was already disappearing around the corner, leaving only the faint scent of cleaning solution and the echo of his footsteps. That afternoon, I found Sophie in our usual spot, Mr. Peterson's classroom after hours. She was staring at a cream-colored envelope with gold embossing, the gala invitation. Your mother came by this morning, I said, sliding into a desk beside her. To make sure you'll document my arranged marriage properly? Her attempt at humor fell flat. She's been talking about James Richardson for weeks. Apparently, he's perfect Harvard-bound, family money, summer house in the Hamptons. She crumpled the invitation suddenly. I hate him already. Have you told Marcus about the gala? How can I? She smoothed out the invitation, her fingers tracing the embossed letters. He's working so hard, Ben. Not just at school. Did you know he's taking online courses? Studying for exams between shifts? He won't let his dreams die, and her voice caught. I love that about him, but I also know he'd step aside if he thought he was holding me back from some better future. She pulled out another letter from her bag, Marcus's latest. Listen to this. Sometimes I watch you in the hallways, moving through your world of privilege and promise, and I wonder if I'm being selfish. If loving you is like trying to catch starlight in my hands, beautiful but impossible to hold on to. Her voice broke a little. How can he not see that he's the one who makes me feel real? That all of this, she gestured at the invitation, is what feels impossible to hold on to. I was about to respond when we heard footsteps in the hall. Sophie quickly tucked away the letter as the door opened, revealing none other than Marcus's father, John Sullivan. He was moving slowly, leaning heavily on his mop for support, his injury from the accident still clearly causing him pain. Oh, excuse me, he said, seeing us. Didn't realize anyone was still here. It's fine, Mr. Sullivan, Sophie said softly. We were just leaving. Something in her voice made him pause. He looked at her, really looked at her, and for a moment, I saw a flash of recognition in his eyes. Later, I would wonder if he had known all along about the letters, about his son's secret love for the girl everyone thought was too perfect to fall in love. But at that moment, he just nodded and began his slow progress across the room. As we gathered our things to leave, I heard him humming softly and realized with a start that it was Sonnet 17. The same Neruda poem Marcus had quoted to Sophie in the library all those months ago. Sophie froze, her hand clutching her bag. When I looked at her, there were tears in her eyes again. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about Marcus listening to study guides while cleaning empty hallways, about Sophie's tears, about Mr. Sullivan's knowing look, about how love stories aren't always about grand gestures and dramatic declarations. Sometimes they're about cleaning floors and writing letters and holding on to dreams that everyone else says you should let go. I opened my laptop and began to write. Not for the school newspaper, but for myself. For Sophie and Marcus. For anyone who's ever been told their love story didn't fit into the neat boxes society had prepared for them. What I didn't know then was that my late-night writing session would soon become crucially important. Because the next morning, everything would change. Sophie's carefully constructed world of secret letters and stolen glances was about to collide with the reality of her parents' expectations in a way none of us could have predicted. And I would be right in the middle of it all, watching as a love story either fell apart or found the strength to become something more than just beautiful words on paper. They say there's a calm before the storm. But sometimes the storm comes out of nowhere on the most ordinary of days, when you're least expecting it. It was a Thursday morning when everything fell apart. I was in the newspaper office, editing photos for the upcoming issue, when I heard the commotion in the hallway. By the time I got there, a crowd had already formed outside the principal's office. Through the glass walls, I could see Sophie facing her parents, her face pale but composed. Marcus stood a few feet away, still in his work clothes, his father beside him. 20 minutes earlier, Mrs. Montgomery had arrived early for a school board meeting. She'd decided to stop by Sophie's locker to leave a surprise. Samples for gala dresses. Instead, she found something else. Hundreds of letters, carefully bound with blue ribbon, hidden behind a loose panel. I learned the details later, pieced together from whispered conversations and my own observations. How Mrs. Montgomery had started reading right there in the hallway, her manicured hands shaking as she realized what she was holding. How she'd immediately called her husband, who'd arrived in record time, his face thunderous. How Sophie, hearing the commotion, had run from her AP literature class only to find her most precious secrets exposed to the world. "This is completely unacceptable," Richard Montgomery's voice boomed through the principal's door. "My daughter secretly corresponding with the janitor's son? Do you have any idea what this could do to our family's reputation?" "Dad, please." Sophie's voice was steady, though I could see her hands trembling. "Be quiet, Sophie," her mother snapped. "This is precisely why we've tried to guide your social interactions. But instead of accepting James Richardson's attention like any sensible girl, you've been carrying on some sort of tawdry romance with—" "It's not tawdry," Marcus spoke up for the first time. "I love your daughter, Mrs. Montgomery. And if you just read those letters—" "Love?" Richard Montgomery laughed harshly. "What could you possibly offer her? A life of cleaning floors? Living paycheck to paycheck? Sophie was meant for more than that." "With all due respect, sir," John Sullivan's quiet voice cut through the tension, "you don't know my son." That's when Principal Roberts finally managed to take control of the situation, ordering everyone but the immediate family members out of his office. As the crowd reluctantly dispersed, I caught Sophie's eye through the glass. The look she gave me was desperate, pleading. I knew what I had to do. Racing back to the newspaper office, I pulled out my laptop and the story I'd been writing in secret. The real story of Sophie and Marcus. Not the superficial tale of a rich girl and a poor boy, but the truth about two people who found each other through words, who shared dreams bigger than their circumstances, who loved each other not in spite of their differences, but because of who they truly were. I was halfway through editing when Jenny Chun, my assistant editor, burst in. "Ben, you need to see this." She handed me her phone, opened to the school's academic announcements page. My heart stopped when I read the headline, Riverside High student Marcus Sullivan awarded full scholarship to Princeton University. The article went on to detail how Marcus had continued his studies in secret, earning his GED while working full-time, achieving perfect scores on both his SATs and ACTs, and writing an essay that had apparently moved the admissions board to tears. His acceptance had been expedited due to exceptional circumstances. But that wasn't all. The article mentioned his other accomplishments: published poetry in national journals under a pen name, a research paper on educational inequality that had caught the attention of academic circles, tutoring underprivileged kids at the local library on weekends. "Did you know about this?" Jenny asked. "Not all of it," I admitted. "But I know someone who needs to see it right now." I printed the article and ran back to the principal's office, only to find it empty. A passing teacher told me the Montgomerys had left, practically dragging Sophie with them. Marcus and his father were gone too. I found Marcus in the school library, our stories beginning coming full circle. He was sitting alone among the shelves, holding one of Sophie's letters. "They're sending her to live with her aunt in Connecticut," he said without looking up, "until the gala is over, until she comes to her senses." He laughed bitterly. Maybe they're right. Maybe I was fooling myself thinking. I thrust the printed article in front of him. "Is this why you never told her? Because you wanted to prove yourself first?" He took the paper, his hands shaking slightly. "I didn't want her to wait for me. I didn't want her to put her life on hold for something that might never happen." He looked up at me, his eyes fierce. "Do you know what it's like to love someone so much that you'd rather let them go than risk holding them back? But that wasn't your choice to make," a voice said from behind us. We turned to see John Sullivan standing there, leaning on his cane. "Son, I've watched you work yourself to exhaustion, studying all night, never complaining. I've seen those letters you two wrote. Yes, I knew about them. The way you look at each other. It reminds me of your mother and me." Marcus stared at his father in shock. "Dad, your mother was from a wealthy family too, you know. They disowned her when she chose me, but she never regretted it. Not once in all our years together." He placed a hand on Marcus's shoulder. "She'd be so proud of you, son, but she'd also tell you that real love deserves a fighting chance." The library fell silent as Marcus absorbed his father's words. Then suddenly he stood up. "I need your help," he said to me. "Both of you. I have an idea, but we'll have to work fast." As he outlined his plan, I realized that this story was far from over. The storm hadn't just broken. It had cleared the air, revealing truths that had been hidden for too long. And maybe, just maybe, those truths would be enough to give this love story the ending it deserved. But first, we had a gala to prepare for, and only 2 weeks to pull off what might be either the most romantic or the most disastrous moment in Riverside High's history. The Riverside Country Club had never looked more elegant. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over the ballroom, their light catching on the silver and china that adorned dozens of perfectly set tables. Outside, the late spring evening painted the sky in shades of purple and gold, while inside, the wealthy and powerful of our town gathered to celebrate their children's graduation. I adjusted my borrowed tuxedo and checked my camera settings for the 10th time. As the official photographer, I had unprecedented access to every corner of the event. What the Montgomerys didn't know was that my camera wasn't the only thing I'd smuggled in. Sophie had returned from Connecticut that morning, and her entrance into the ballroom was nothing short of breathtaking. She wore a midnight blue gown that seemed to catch every light in the room, her honey blonde hair elegantly swept up. But it was her eyes that caught my attention. They weren't defeated as I'd feared. They were determined. "Everything set," I whispered as I passed by, pretending to adjust my camera lens. She gave an almost imperceptible nod. James Richardson appeared exactly as advertised: tall, handsome, Harvard-bound, and utterly pleased with himself. He'd barely finished introducing himself to Sophie when Mrs. Montgomery swooped in, practically pushing them toward the dance floor. "They make such a lovely couple," she said to anyone who would listen. But I noticed her eyes constantly scanning the room, as if expecting trouble. She'd doubled the security for the event, and I knew they'd been given specific instructions about keeping certain uninvited guests out. What she didn't know was that we'd already gotten everything, and everyone we needed inside long before the first guest arrived. The evening progressed according to schedule. Dinner was served, speeches were made, and Mrs. Montgomery beamed as Sophie and James shared their obligatory dance. But beneath the perfect surface, a current of tension ran through the room. Those who knew about the scandal kept throwing glances at Sophie, whispering behind their hands. Then came the moment we'd been waiting for. Richard Montgomery took the stage, champagne glass in hand. Distinguished guests, fellow parents, and most importantly, our graduating class of 2024, he began. Tonight we celebrate not just academic achievement, but the bright future ahead of these remarkable young people. And speaking of bright futures, he smiled at James Richardson. I have a special announcement to make. That was our cue. The lights dimmed unexpectedly, causing a murmur of confusion. Then, from the grand piano in the corner, the first notes of a familiar melody began to play. I recognized it immediately, Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, Sophie's favorite piece. The pianist was hidden in shadow, but I knew it was Marcus. He'd spent the last 2 weeks practicing relentlessly, his hands raw from both manual labor and piano keys. As the music filled the room, a spotlight suddenly illuminated an elderly woman who had risen from her seat near the front. Eleanor Montgomery, Sophie's grandmother and the family matriarch, stood with the aid of her cane, her silver hair gleaming in the light. In her other hand, she held a familiar cream-colored envelope. I believe, she said, her voice clear and strong despite her age, that before any announcements are made, there's something everyone here needs to hear. Mrs. Montgomery stepped forward, alarmed. Mother, this isn't the time. It's exactly the time, Victoria. Eleanor's voice carried an authority that made even Richard Montgomery pause. I've sat silent for far too long, watching history repeat itself. Not tonight. She opened the envelope and pulled out a letter, not one of Sophie and Marcus's, but something much older. The paper was yellowed with age, the ink faded. 52 years ago, Eleanor began, I received this letter from the man I loved. Like Sophie, I was expected to marry someone suitable, someone from our social circle. Instead, I fell in love with a brilliant young man who worked as a groundskeeper at my father's estate while putting himself through medical school. A shocked silence fell over the room. Even Sophie looked stunned. This was one part of the plan she hadn't known about. My father threatened to disown me, Eleanor continued, said I would regret throwing away my future for some penniless dreamer. And her voice caught. I listened. I chose security over love. That penniless dreamer went on to become one of the country's leading neurosurgeons, while I spent decades in a loveless marriage, watching my own daughter repeat the same patterns of prejudice that stole my happiness. She turned to face Sophie directly. My dear girl, I found your letters. Mrs. Montgomery gasped. Mother, you went through her things?
No, Victoria.
She came to me, showed me every letter, told me everything. And as I read them, I saw myself at her age. The same fears, the same dreams, the same pure and precious love that our family's so-called standards would destroy. The music from the piano had softened but continued to play, providing a haunting backdrop to Eleanor's words. In the shadows, I saw Marcus's shoulders tense as he played, waiting. But Sophie is braver than I was, Eleanor said proudly. And the young man she loves. She gestured to the piano just as the spotlight swung to illuminate Marcus. There were audible gasps as people recognized him, now dressed in an impeccable tuxedo that Eleanor herself had arranged. Marcus stood, facing the crowd with quiet dignity. Mr. Montgomery, he said, his voice steady. You asked what I could offer your daughter. The answer is everything I am and everything I hope to become. I'm not just the janitor's son. I'm a Princeton University scholarship recipient. I'm a published poet. I'm someone who loves your daughter for exactly who she is, not what her name can offer me. He walked to where Sophie stood frozen in the center of the ballroom. James Richardson had already backed away, sensing the shift in the room's atmosphere. But more importantly, Marcus continued, pulling out a worn notebook, I can offer her truth, the kind we've shared in hundreds of letters, the kind that sees beyond wealth and status to who we really are. He opened the notebook and began to read, My dearest Sophie, there are 1,000 reasons why we shouldn't work. The world has drawn lines between us, lines of class, of expectation, of society's narrow vision of what love should look like. But every time I see you, every time I read your words, those lines fade away until all I can see is you, the real you, the girl who dreams of teaching kindergarten even though her parents want her in corporate boardrooms, the girl who sneaks extra food to the stray cats behind the school, the girl who wrote me a 12-page letter analyzing a single Emily Dickinson poem because she knew it would make me smile. Sophie was crying now, but smiling through her tears. She took a step toward Marcus, then another, as if drawn by an invisible force. Richard Montgomery started forward, his face dark with anger, but Eleanor's voice cracked like a whip. Richard, if you stop her, if you force her to make the same mistake I did, I will ensure that every penny of my fortune, which, need I remind you, is still considerable, goes to establishing a scholarship fund for underprivileged students. In Marcus's name, the threat, elegant in its simplicity, stopped him in his tracks. Beside him, Mrs. Montgomery seemed to deflate, as if seeing her own mother's pain for the first time. In the silence that followed, Sophie finally reached Marcus. Without hesitation, she took the notebook from his hands and opened it to a marked page. My turn, she said, her voice ringing clear through the ballroom. Because these aren't just his words. They're our story. And as Sophie began to read their shared words, as Marcus looked at her with such pure adoration, as Eleanor Montgomery smiled through her own tears, I raised my camera. Because some moments deserve to be remembered, even if they don't fit into society's perfectly arranged plans. But none of us could have predicted what would happen next, a twist that would test not just Sophie and Marcus's love, but everything we thought we knew about sacrifice, redemption, and the true meaning of family legacy. The moment Sophie finished reading, before anyone could react, the ballroom doors burst open. John Sullivan walked in, supported not by his usual cane, but by Dr. William Chun, the renowned neurosurgeon who'd been quietly treating him for the past month, thanks to Eleanor Montgomery's intervention. But it wasn't their entrance that caused the room to fall silent. It was what John carried, a small, worn, leather briefcase. I think, he said, his voice carrying in the hushed room, it's time everyone knew the whole truth. He placed the briefcase on a nearby table and opened it carefully. Inside were hundreds of letters, their paper yellowed with age, tied with faded ribbons. But these weren't Sophie and Marcus's letters. The first envelope was addressed to my dearest Elizabeth Sullivan, Marcus's mother. Before my wife passed, John said, looking directly at Richard Montgomery, she made me promise to keep these safe. She said someday they might help another love story find its way. He pulled out one letter and handed it to Eleanor Montgomery. I believe you might recognize the handwriting, Mrs. Montgomery. After all, you wrote some of them yourself. Eleanor's hands trembled as she took the letter. Elizabeth was your cousin's daughter? The one who disappeared after choosing love over family fortune? John smiled sadly. She never disappeared. She just found a different kind of wealth, one measured in love and dignity rather than dollars and cents. The revelation rippled through the room like a shock wave. Elizabeth Sullivan, Marcus's mother, had been born Elizabeth Fairchild, a member of one of the oldest, wealthiest families in the state. She'd walked away from everything to marry John Sullivan, and never looked back. Richard Montgomery staggered slightly, reaching for a chair. You mean, all this time? All this time, John confirmed. Your daughter has been falling in love with someone from her own social circle, if you care about such things. Marcus isn't just my son. He's the grandson of the Fairchild fortune, even if his mother chose to leave that behind. But Marcus stepped forward, shaking his head. No, that's not who I am, Dad. That's not why Sophie loves me, and it's not why I love her. He turned to face the crowd. I'm proud to be John Sullivan's son. Proud to be the son of a woman who chose love over money. And yes, I'm proud to have worked as a janitor to help my family. Sophie moved to stand beside him, taking his hand. And I'm proud to love him. Not because of his hidden heritage or his Princeton scholarship or his published poetry, but because of his heart. Because he sees me, really sees me. She turned to face her parents. Mom, Dad, all my life you've told me about maintaining our family's legacy. But maybe legacy isn't just about money or social status. Maybe it's about courage. The courage to choose love, like Eleanor wished she had. The courage to start over, like Elizabeth Sullivan did. The courage to work hard and dream big, like Marcus has. Mrs. Montgomery was crying now, mascara trailing down her cheeks. Richard Montgomery looked lost, the foundations of his worldview visibly shaking. That's when Eleanor stepped forward again, but this time she was holding something new. Adoption papers. Elizabeth Sullivan was more than my cousin's daughter, she said quietly. She was my goddaughter, and before she died, she made me promise to watch over her son. I've failed in that promise for too long, trying to protect my own family's reputation. But tonight, I'm making it right. She turned to Marcus. If you'll accept, I want to legally adopt you. Not to give you access to the fortune, though that will be yours if you want it, but to formally make you part of this family. To give you and Sophie the chance that Elizabeth and John had to fight for. The room erupted in murmurs. James Richardson had long since slipped away. Richard Montgomery looked like he'd been hit by lightning. But among all the chaos, Marcus and Sophie only had eyes for each other. Well, Marcus said softly, I suppose this means you won't have to write me secret letters anymore. Sophie laughed through her tears. Oh, I'll still write you letters. Every day. Forever. Because some things are too important to just say out loud. 1 year later, I sat in the Princeton University garden, watching Sophie and Marcus graduate together, she with a degree in education, he with dual honors in literature and social justice. Eleanor Montgomery sat in the front row, beaming with pride, while John Sullivan and the Montgomerys shared a row behind her, their old prejudices slowly healing with time. Sophie had turned down her father's offer to join the family business, instead accepting a position teaching at an inner-city elementary school. Marcus's first book of poetry was already getting attention from major publishers. Together, they'd started a foundation that provided scholarships to students bridging social divides through art and literature. As for me, I got into journalism school, inspired by watching their story unfold. Sometimes the best stories are the ones that challenge our assumptions about what's possible. After the ceremony, Sophie handed me an envelope. Inside was a letter, the first one she'd ever written to Marcus, the one that started it all. On the back, she'd written a note to me. Thank you for helping us tell our story, for showing us that love isn't just about grand gestures or dramatic revelations. Sometimes it's about quiet moments in empty classrooms, about words written in secret, about the courage to see people for who they really are. Most of all, thank you for teaching us that every love story matters, even especially the ones that don't fit society's script. P.S. Marcus and I are starting a creative writing program at the community center. We'd love it if you'd help teach the journalism section. After all, you're pretty good at spotting a story worth telling. I smiled, carefully folding the letter and putting it in my pocket. Outside, the spring sun was setting over Princeton's ancient towers, painting the sky in the same colors as that rainy evening when I first discovered their secret. But now there were no more secrets, no more hidden letters, no more invisible lines dividing people who loved each other. Just stories waiting to be told, and the courage to tell them.